Hi everybody, it's Senpai Fanfics back at it with another amazing content. What if Deku possessed Sentient Quirk? If you guys would like to see more videos like this in the future, hit the subscribe button and notifications on for more videos like this. Thank you to the creator of the fanfic, which will be linked below. Let's start it. All Might watches in quiet bemusement, head whipping this way and that as we seemingly appear and disappear on the regular. He eventually praises our coordination and efficiency. Izuku is pleased as punch to have his favorite hero's approval, if the way his elation sends our link humming like a tuning fork hitting the right note is any indication. We managed to put a decent dent into the one pile this first day, but it's easy to tell that despite there being two of us, Izuku and I will still be in this for the long haul. The first week is, well, it is. Following the assigned schedule and meal plan to the letter is challenging in some ways and easier in others. Thankfully, Inko doesn't take any issue with changing up the menu. Rather, she seems more than happy to accommodate the sudden and doubtlessly unusual request. When Izuku ventures to ask why, Inko's expression softens, turns almost wistful. Oh, Izuku. You've never really asked for much. She pauses, and the wistfulness gives way to warmth. So when you do ask for something, well, so long as it isn't harmful to you, and it's within my capabilities, it makes me happy to know that I can help and support you. Izuku promptly bursts into tears, which then sets off Inko's waterworks, and I can't help but shed a few relieved tears of my own. I had worried, ever since that day. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't need to worry so much, after all. The exercise regimens we follow prove intense, but it makes sense. They're meant to push Izuku and I to our limits, to build us up and help us improve further. I have to occasionally rein Izuku in, keep him from herring off and overdoing things in his haste to get ready. We're both painfully aware of the UA entrance exam date that's less than a year away. But you can't overdo it, Izuku, I eventually tell him point blank. You'll risk setting yourself back and losing progress. Trust that All Might knows what he's doing regarding the fitness exercises. Thankfully, that seems to do the trick. It's around the start of the second week that something goes wrong, though none of us really realize it. It starts with Izuku gradually getting hungrier faster or more often. When I'm the one on the physical plane, hunger pangs frequently make themselves known to me. They subside, and we dismiss it in favor of sticking to the meal plan. I start slowing down and write it off as fatigue from the newly increased workload. I just need to adjust, I tell myself, that's all. By the end of the second week, it becomes apparent just how wrong I am. The only warning I get is Izuku stumbling in my peripheral before the stretch of sand in front of me rises up to meet me. The other man, all for one, most likely, on the other hand, looks like he's seen, or seeing, a ghost. A choked Yoichi reaches my ears, and I stiffen. Fuck. If that doesn't practically confirm some of my earlier suspicions, I don't know what will. I send a panicked look to All Might, before a tremor from the civilian I'm propping up shakes me from the threatening spiral. Numb rationality takes over. I now have this reality's equivalent of the Godfather, on steroids, fixated on me. There is a potential hostage that said Godfather would definitely use against All Might right next to me. To All for One, I am now a person of interest, and the poor guy caught up in this mess is, both luckily and unluckily, not. I blink a few times and take in a breath that shudders. Meeting All Might's gaze again, I look meaningfully at the dazed civilian before locking eyes with him once more and shifting so that the civilian will be closer to the hero. The stricken expression that crosses his features is quickly replaced with alarm when All for One starts moving. With all of my strength, I shove the civilian in All Might's direction, firmly planting my feet and placing myself between them and All for One, arms spread wide as if to block any further advance. I'm snatched up by a pair of hands, large, warm, so startlingly warm like only Izuku has ever been up to this moment, barely a moment later, and a glance over my shoulder reveals that All Might got the other person. But not me. I slowly turn my head back to stare owlishly at All for One, slightly curly white hair, cut short to make it appear less so, penetrating red eyes, strong jawline and features, an attempt to silently talk my heart down from beating its way out of my ribcage. In the space of a second, All for One turns on his heel and steals away from the battlefield with me in tow. It takes maybe a minute or two, but All Might manages to track us down. He probably had to move the other civilian to safety before pursuing my kidnapper and I. In a shocking show of restraint, All for One opts to fall back on what I presume are stealth-oriented quirks to eventually evade the number one hero, as opposed to wreaking indiscriminate havoc to shake off the tail. Guess he doesn't have a suitable warp quirk in his selection to make a swift and clean getaway. It isn't until All for One slows to a stop in a dingy alleyway tucked out of the way from the more major thoroughfares to listen for sounds of pursuit that I start kicking my brain back into gear. All for One's got me, and is under the misconception that I am something equivalent to his long-deceased younger brother. He'll never willingly let me go. Which means I need to figure out how to go back to being intangible, stat. I close my eyes and frantically try to recall possible triggers that led to me becoming corporeal. What was different from all the other times I'd tried to affect the world around me? It wasn't simply desperation. I've always been desperate to protect Izuku from his bullies. Then what? Reaching can't be it, either. Come on, I need to think quirks, activation requirements, how they function, potential mechanisms, paths of evolution. Inko. Attraction of small objects. She gestures, she pulls. I pulled on something, and that brought me to the physical plane. There's only one thing I can think of that I can pull on, aside from Izuku. Our link, the mental tether that joins us together, even when we remain far apart. I try tugging on it, but nothing changes. It's almost like there's no give left on my end. All for One still has a hold of me, and he's starting to turn the entirety of his terrifying focus to my person. The air is charged and intense, practically balanced on a knife's edge. Yoichi, he breathes, a disbelieving prayer. I shift jerkily in his firm grip, less an attempt to escape and more an outlet to vent the nervous energy jangling my poor nerves, and peer past my straight snowy white bangs to meet his searching gaze warily. I don't go by that name, I rasp out, keeping my response purposefully vague and open-ended. He reads an unspoken anymore into the statement that I very intentionally didn't supply. While he's distracted, I return the majority of my attention back to the mechanics of the quirk I share with Izuku. If pulling on my end doesn't work, then that probably means that Izuku is the one that needs to pull. Izuku! A jolt of alarm echoes across our link from his end in response. What? Yukuto? What is it? What's wrong? Izuku, I need you to do me a favor. I promise I'll explain later. You know our shared mental link? I need you to pull on that. Just give it a good, mighty yank. All for One's eyes narrow, and his hands tighten around me, as if he can somehow sense my mounting intent to get the hell out of Dodge. Any time now would be great, I think I. The second I step foot into Izuku's room with an exhausted, I'm home, I am greeted with a desperate, violently shaking hug and a barrage of whispered questions. It's times like this, when Izuku's anxiety or agitation is through the roof, that his thoughts bypass the link and find themselves voiced. I return the embrace and murmur assurances that I'm okay. When I'm released, I step back and eye Izuku carefully out of habit, cataloguing a few injuries that weren't there before I left, and suppress the urge to click my tongue in frustration. Starburst first and second-degree burns, and long gouges and scrapes from a single claw or talon. I recognize the patterns, and can glean their sources, unfortunately. Bakugo and Tsubasa hurt Izuku again, it looks like. What happened? Izuku breathes under his breath once he's calmed down somewhat. His emerald gaze is alight with concern, and I soften somewhat. I figured out how to be seen, and grabbed, in the middle of a really tense situation, I admit, and Izuku's eyes widen even further, his excitement over the discovery warring with his alarm over the rest of the not-so-exciting implications. I motion for Izuku to take a seat, and after a moment, I join him on his bed. I need you to listen very carefully until the end, okay, Izuku? I send across our link, tone reflexively hushed. I have a feeling I saw a lot of things, dangerous things, that I probably shouldn't have. Izuku nods his head fervently, putting up a brave front even as he swallows nervously. I saw a man fighting All Might, and he was just as strong as, if not stronger than, him. Izuku pales, and I nod grimly. While they were fighting, I found someone stuck in some rubble from their altercation. Someone who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here I pause, a lump forming in my throat, remembering that too familiar, all-encompassing feeling of helplessness. I ran to try to help him, forgetting in the moment that only you can sense and interact with me. I was so afraid and frustrated, and I wanted to help him. All I needed to do was just get a grip and pull. And suddenly I was there. I could feel the wind, and dust and gravel bounced off me. I gesture at my scrapes to prove my claim. Izuku inhales sharply, and I continue. I could interact with my surroundings, and I managed to get the person out of the pile of debris. I was so frantic, trying to get him to get up, to move, because I couldn't support his full weight on my own, and I think I started yelling at him at some point. I reach a trembling hand up to run through my hair. And then the whole area just went quiet. Before, there were howling gusts of wind, explosions from concrete being smashed to smithereens, shouts and all of that just fell silent. When the dust cleared, there was All Might, and the guy he was fighting. Just staring at me. By this point, Izuku is barely breathing, riveted by my account. The guy that was fighting All Might, I start hoarsely. He looked at me as if I was someone else, someone he recognized and knew. Called me by someone else's name. Here Izuku's hand darts forward to curl around mine, attempting to both draw and give comfort from the contact. Soft and careful. Warm. I know things, Izuku. A lot of them I can't tell you just yet, or can't tell you, ever. But I know the name that man called me, and who it belonged to. I know who he thought I was. I tighten my grip on Izuku's hand. I'm not them, but that didn't stop him from trying to take me away. Izuku sucks in a breath that practically hisses through his teeth. I pushed the person I pulled from the rubble to All Might, and stood between the both of them and the other guy. He grabbed me and ran, gave even All Might the runaround. He'd just gotten away when I figured out how to escape, and reached out to you. Our link, Izuku's voice warbles across. That's right, I confirm with a nod. Our link. I want to try something, Izuku. I'm going to pull on my end of the link, and I want you to see if Inko can see or hear you after. Are you okay with that? Of course. He scrambles to his feet, grateful for the distraction, for something to do, and I reach for the link, gently pulling it, as if it were a thread, a rope, towards me until I can't anymore. There's hardly any discernible change, but Izuku and I never lose sight of one another. You're up, I tell him, giving him an encouraging nod. He rushes out of his room, and I hear when he calls out, "Hey Mom, what are we having for dinner?" I'm starved. I think it occurs to us simultaneously, especially now that we're not in the middle of an emergency or hopped up on adrenaline. The distinct and insistent, almost forgotten, gnawing ache of hunger curdling in my gut, and its absence in Izuku. When Izuku comes back, he comes back slowly, shell-shocked. She didn't hear or see me, he says aloud, sounding as if he isn't sure what to think about it, and my hands went straight through her. She didn't notice a thing. Now doesn't that sound familiar? Pull on your end of the link, and try again, I coach, and Izuku does as instructed. He pauses briefly in surprise, raising a hand to his stomach, and I know. That ache he's now feeling is no longer with me anymore. This time I follow him all the way to the threshold of the kitchen. Mom, I'm hungry, he says, softer this time. Inko immediately turns to him with a blink before smiling kindly. The katsudon will be ready in just a few minutes, she assures him, and turns back to dinner prep. Would you be a dear and help set the table? It might help the time pass faster. Izuku, Mr. Literally incapable of refusing a request for aid, immediately starts pulling out dishes and tableware. My mouth quirks up in a fond smile at the sight. His expression looks a little lost as he bustles about the kitchen and dining table, so I take pity on him. We can talk about and experiment with our quirk some more later, I tell him softly, briefly placing my hand on his shoulder and giving it a gentle squeeze. He nods, a strange look coming over his round and freckled features. Later, he agrees over our link, as Inko's still within earshot, and I sit back to watch as dinner moves to the table and mother and son sit down to eat. He doesn't so much as mention a peep of our discovery, our quirk, even now when it's effortlessly provable. I frown slightly, perplexed. I would have expected Izuku to announce it right away, and then he'd be able to celebrate with Inko. But instead, he keeps his silence. "Aren't you going to tell her?" is the first thing I ask Izuku after he's eaten and helped with the cleanup. In the safety and privacy of his room, he slumps against the wall adjacent to his bed. "I thought about it," he admits. "But I can't." "Can't?" I echo, eyebrows raising. He looks to me with a serious glint in his gaze, a resolute slant to his mouth that looks out of place on such a young face. "If I tell her, I'll have to tell others when I get our quirk registered. I'll have to tell others about you." I recoil, taken aback. "And that's a bad thing?" I ask, trying not to let the thought hurt. "You said earlier that that man, the one who was as strong as All Might, tried to take you. If I register us, it could lead him right to you," he explains, his voice shaking near the end. Terror shoots down my spine at the thought of someone like All for One coming after Izuku and his mother, hunting me down for who knows what. "I won't let him take you, Yukuto," he asserts. "We're nowhere near strong enough to fend off someone on All Might's level. So I'll keep you safe and hidden, even if it means lying about our quirk to the whole world," he finishes with a tremulous smile. This smart, selfless, little saint. Shit, here come the waterworks. My vision blurs and tears start trickling down my face. "Are you sure?" I ask. He nods firmly. "You're always there to protect me, Yukuto. Let me do the same for you." My breath hitches. That is so fucking unfair, I swear to the gods. "Language, Yukuto," he chides, as if he's the eldest between the two of us. He most certainly is not. Huffing a weak laugh, I open my arms up for a hug, and he hurries to oblige. "Fine," I rasp out, soaking in the warmth. "You win. But in exchange, let me be your scout at school, and guide you away from your bullies before they can corner you. No more hanging around people who hurt you. Deal?" "Okay." "That includes Bakugo," I press, angling my head to regard him out of the corner of my eye. To my surprise, he actually nods confirmation, his forehead digging into my shoulder with the movement. He wasn't being a very good friend anyway, was he? It said with such a subdued and poignant resignation. A painful lump forms in my throat. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for Izuku to come to that conclusion, much less admit it out loud. I have no words, so I only hug him tighter in response. After our heart-to-heart, I don't have to look far to find a way to lift the overarching mood. "So, looks like we have some updates to add on the entry for our quirk," I comment, patting Izuku's back gently before pulling away. Izuku visibly brightens, almost like an energetic puppy that was just told they'd be going for a walk, and I probably couldn't stop the fond smile spreading across my face even if I bothered trying. "Never change, Izuku." Practically diving for his desk and yanking one of the drawers open, Izuku reaches in where the notebook dedicated to our quirk, more than one, is sequestered away amidst a number of other filled compositions covering a myriad of topics related to heroics. Once he's located the volume in question and snapped up a pen, he takes a seat and immediately starts looking for the next blank page. Just as he's about to put pencil to paper, he pauses as a thought occurs to him. Izuku turns to me, eyebrows furrowing, his emerald gaze flickering over me. "You're covered in dirt," he says, like a realization, like the observation is a puzzle piece he's contemplating where to fit. I glance down and, sure enough, the plain white t-shirt I've had since the beginning is practically tanned in patches where dust and dirt caked into the fabric. My dark shorts and shoes appear to have the same problem. But none of the dirt rubbed off on me when we hugged, he continues slowly. His eyes trail down to the floor, where a set of shoe prints sporting a distinctive tread are apparent. "Who? That is odd." You can sense me, but technically, the dust isn't a part of me, and maybe that's why. I posit, the note of uncertainty in my tone clear. One way to find out, Izuku says with a shrug. Become physical for a moment? I nod and pull on the link until I can't anymore, then do a double take. Izuku, your pencil. It's not falling through him. He's still holding it without issue. He stares at the pencil owlishly. I reach over curiously to poke at it, and my finger passes straight through it. We both boggle at that, and Izuku accidentally drops the writing implement in surprise. It lands with a quiet clatter that leaves us both cringing reflexively, and with a muttered apology, Izuku leans down to pick it up. Only, this time, his fingers pass through it. There is a long moment of silence as we each scramble to understand the implications of this series of discoveries. Just to confirm, I shuffle over and reach down for the pencil, and grab it without incident, lifting it and setting it back down on the desk. Okay, let's break this down, I say weakly, my voice hushed. This is a lot. I think we were wrong about more than one this whole time, Izuku breathes. It's not that you're a ghost only I can sense, or that you're just invisible and untouchable in general, or that we can go back and forth between being intangible and tangible so much as we can access two separate planes. Physical and imperceptible, I supply for the names of said planes. Izuku still needs some work on naming sense, feeling a little lightheaded. I feel Izuku pull on our link, and he picks up his pencil and starts writing, mumbles rumbling across our link as he goes. From just now, we could confirm that 1, we can carry objects with us from one plane to the other. 2, if we lose contact with said objects, they will, probably, return to their plane of origin. And 3, you and I are sort of exceptions to the rules, since we can interact with each other, but not objects we're holding, regardless of who is in which plane. By this point, we're both hunched over the notebook, our heads almost literally put together in our eagerness to record our breakthroughs. Is there a limit to how much we can carry over? Or to what kinds of things we can bring? It turns out that I can take a shower now. But I nearly shriek like the banshee I vaguely resemble when the spray first hits me. It's fucking cold, and it's too much at once. Izuku immediately yanks on our link, pulling me out and away from the sudden shock of frigid water and the overwhelming feeling of the water spray, countless droplets impacting like bullets all at once in a seemingly endless deluge, on what feels like oversensitized skin. I'm left crouching in the tub and shivering from the unexpected sensory overload. What's wrong? What happened? Are you okay? Yukuto? Talk to me, please. Izuku. He's hovering over me, hands fluttering about anxiously, his gaze alight with panic. My exhale shudders on its way out. Fuck, I breathe, and this time, Izuku doesn't call me out on my language. I don't know why, it felt like too much all at once. The realization creeps in slowly. I'm not used to it, to physically feeling anything. I breathe. Aside from occasional contact with you, nothing else reaches me. I start to explain haltingly to Izuku, who listens without interruption. Temperature and texture and stuff, I haven't had any exposure to it for. Izuku carefully wraps a hand around one of mine to comfort me, gaze softening and regarding me without judgment. It's like I'm coming out of some sort of long-term, selective sensory deprivation. I finish, my voice coming out hoarse. What do you need? How can we help deal with this? He finally asks, his voice a quiet whisper. I run a shaky hand through my damp hair, still a bit wet and slick, plastered uncomfortably to my skin, and still cold, as I try to remember if I ever learned anything about this in my past life. I come up blank. I don't know, I confess, my gut wrenching with discomfort and unease. My guess would be to slowly reintroduce me to physical sensations little by little, and increase intensity as I grow used to it, but I can't be sure. It might be better to look up solutions. Sorry I scared you, Izuku. He shakes his head sharply. Don't apologize, he nearly commands, glaring to drive his point home. You didn't know this would happen. Caught off guard by Izuku's uncharacteristic vehemence, I simply nod dumbly. Give me a second, maybe we can try a washcloth or something, he mutters. Let's get you out of the tub and then I'll turn the water back on. We can let it heat up a bit and then you can determine if the temperature's alright by sticking only your hand into the spray. Does that sound okay to you? I nod again, grateful to have a tentative plan of action, at the very least. The hiss of the shower turning back on fills the bathroom, and I'm left to just sit and listen and process while Izuku fetches a washcloth. He comes back with the promised swatch of fabric and then some. He brought a shirt and pair of shorts and boxers from his own wardrobe. Your clothes need to be washed, he says in explanation when he notices my curious expression. I can just sneak them into my laundry. In the meantime, you can use some of my clothes, if our quirk allows for it the way I think it should. Right, I answer tiredly. Wanna set them down? I'm about to test the water. It takes for more adjustments to the water temp, too hot, too cold, then finally good enough, before I'm able to soap up and wet a washcloth to wipe myself down. The shower spray is just too much for me at the moment. Izuku stays nearby just in case I need help, but takes care to respect my privacy. My skin crawls with the way the hand towel rasps across my skin, and I have to remind myself that it's not actually scraping my skin raw, despite how careful or gentle I try to be. My scrapes from earlier burn when the soap comes into contact with them, to the point that tears are falling from my eyes no matter how hard I try to breathe through the sting and blink them away. This could be a problem if we don't find a way to address it. Because if this pattern holds, then my pain tolerance is probably now in the negative numbers. Heroics is a risky occupation, where injury is practically a guarantee. And having a weakness like this can't be borne. I want to be there with and for Izuku, and that means sucking it up and working to ease my oversensitivity, no matter how uncomfortable it'll undoubtedly be. No matter how long it may take. I'll do it. For Izuku. Because I want to be there as he becomes a hero, and because I want to be a hero, too. After the hellish experience of drying off, the towel felt like fucking sandpaper. I don one of Izuku's t-shirts with the word t-shirt printed across the chest. I immediately take it off, however, unnerved by the tag digging painfully into the base of the back of my neck. When I explain the issue, Izuku ducks out of the bathroom and returns moments later with some scissors. It takes a few attempts to ensure as little of the tag remains to scrape against my skin, before I can wear the shirt with minimal discomfort. The same occurs with some hunter green cargo shorts, though I refrain from commenting on the fabric's rough texture and how it makes my skin prickle and crawl, silently resolving to just suck it up and try to get used to it. Once done, Izuku resumes his place on the physical plane while I shift back to the imperceptible plane. Thankfully, the new clothes stay on my frame like we hypothesized they would. Izuku goes to gather my clothes, and stops short when his hands phase through them. I can't help it. Seeing the baffled look on his face, I snort, then dissolve into helpless laughter. He grins and shakes his head in amused exasperation. Guess those originate from the imperceptible plane, then. Weird. Once I regain composure, I shrug. Looks like they'll just have to be washed by hand. We huddle together on Izuku's bed, and I spend a long stretch of time gathering my thoughts for the explanation I promised earlier. Izuku lets me without complaint, using his phone to search the net for info on how to treat someone sensitive to touch and how to safely help build up a tolerance while he waits. Best little brother and friend ever. Before I was your quirk, I start, breaking the cottony silence draped over our shoulders. Izuku immediately turns off his phone and turns his expectant and undivided attention to me, leaving me swallowing nervously before continuing. I was someone else. I was just an average American who lived day to day, going wherever work required me to without a fuss. There were no quirks, as far as I'm aware, beyond the superpowers imagined in storybooks or made up in movies. Just fiction approximating what we have here today. A glance over shows that Izuku's eyes are wide, his lips parted slightly, as if frozen between breaths or caught with too many questions on the tip of his tongue. I don't know if I'm from a completely different parallel universe, or if I'm just from a point in time before quirks came into the picture. I just know that I'm here now. Do you? Izuku falters, his voice soft and shaky. I motion for him to go ahead. Do you know how you got here? I regard him solemnly. I died, Izuku, I admit point blank, my hushed tone the only effort put into softening the blow. He inhales sharply. It was quick and fairly painless, for me, I think, I say quietly as I look away, not really seeing the room around me anymore. There was a kid about to get hit by a car, and I managed to get him out of harm's way. But I didn't get out of harm's way in time, that is. I shrug. Before I knew it, I was waking up with all my memories intact, for some reason. Thought I'd reincarnated or something, but before long I realized I was little more than a passenger watching someone else's life through their eyes. I pause. A passenger watching your life through your eyes. His breath catches, hitches. Like he's an inch away from dissolving into tears. I don't regret a thing about my circumstances, I tell him, because it's true. By that point in my past life, most of my close family had already passed on, and I was honestly living as if I were dead. A ghost wrapped up in the guise of someone alive. Then I died, and somehow found my way to you. A faint smile lifts the corners of my mouth. You were a bundle of wonder and joy and all of the things that can be considered good in life, practically a breath of fresh air. And I was, for the most part, happy to be there for you. To help as best I could. I huff a laugh. Did you know your first words were in English? Izuku blinks at me and the non sequitur, the tears lining his eyes slipping down his freckled cheeks. Ooh? Yeah, kind of my fault, that. I used to pass the time naming things you looked at in English and Japanese, since I studied it for a time when I was in school. Course, I knew more English than Japanese, consequence of being raised with the language, I explain ruefully with a shrug. But lo and behold, one day, Inko was sitting at the couch, and your green stuffed rabbit was over by her, and I think you wanted it so. Stuffed animal and green rabbit were more or less your first words. Inko looked so lost, and I had to nudge you into saying the Japanese equivalent before she burst into tears and brought you your plushie, I recount fondly. Choked laughter reaches my ears and my grin widens slightly. You know the rest, more or less, I finish with yet another shrug. I'm sorry you died, Izuku says quietly after a long moment where the only sounds were his sniffles and hiccups. But I'm also glad that it brought you here. Is it wrong of me to think that? With Izuku now on board to avoid Bakugo and his other bullies, we funnel his new surplus of time into cultivating the skill sets he wants for heroics. It takes very little to convince Inko to let him start lessons in self-defense and first aid, thankfully. She sees the logic in the former and trusts that Izuku won't use what he learns inappropriately. As for the latter, well, she lets herself hope that the latter is an indication that Izuku is branching out in his dream to help others. I shake my head in amused exasperation. She should know better, Izuku and give up don't belong in the same sentence unless there is a will never there to act as intermediary between the two. Izuku gets odd looks in both classes, but there's little to be done about it. It can't be helped that other people only see him gesturing oddly at thin air when he's actually helping me correct my form during self-defense. It can't be helped that he's the youngest student to take first aid by nearly a decade. That others can't see or hear the adult in the guise of a child whispering explanations in the spaces between lectures heavy on theory, or occasionally reaching over to steady and guide his hands during the practical exercises. Izuku may be the youngest, but he is second to none in focus and dedication. If his fellow students at the dojo or in first aid can't see that, then it's their loss. His teachers, at least, unlike those at elementary, and then middle school, are appreciative of the attentive student he makes, regardless of his perceived oddities. In our search to address my newfound and overwhelming awareness to my sense of touch, we stumble across a number of articles detailing phenomena like touch sensitivity and tactile defensiveness. Exchanging loaded glances, we read through them carefully, hopping from one reference link to another whenever advised, especially when we encounter terms unfamiliar to the both of us. Upon concluding our research binge, we take a moment to process. I can't say for certain if what I have is the same as what's detailed in the articles, but the symptoms seem close enough to at least look into the available treatments that can be attempted without the supervision of a medical professional. The two we consider are weighted clothing, would compression sleeves and socks count toward that? I wonder, and trying out heavy work. Though one thing has to be said, don't follow my example on self-diagnosis and treatment in the future, Izuku. The only reason we're going through with this without a professional opinion is because our options are limited. He nods seriously. I know. Good. Here's hoping at least one of these works. It's Izuku who pushes for me to consider building up a whole wardrobe for me to work with, rather than just 1 or 2 articles of clothing to wear when my original set of shirt, shorts, boxers, and socks are drying after hand washing. After looking up some recommended fabrics and clothing, vetoing the more expensive and high-end products in the process, and nearby outfits likely to stock them, we steel ourselves to ask Inko to take us clothes shopping. To our relief, she seems more than amenable. It's the shopping trip itself that proves challenging. I am not a fan of clothes shopping. Never have been, and probably never will be. Izuku discovers he's also not a fan of clothes shopping unless goofy graphic tees or hero merch are involved. Considering my present sensitivity and personal sense of aesthetics, neither are. We have to constantly move back and forth between the racks of available clothing and the dressing rooms, where I can privately move to the physical plane to try them on. The thrice-damned store tags complicate the whole process, but we manage, for the most part. It's in the dressing room that I get my first real, thorough look at myself. Up to that point I'd been actively avoiding looking at my reflection. I knew, abstractly, that I shared a resemblance to the first wielder of One for All, considering my hair color and All for One's reaction when he saw me. But actually seeing it? I spend a long moment tracing the shape of my sharper, narrower eyes and examining the lighter mint green of my irises and intriguing white of my pupils. My frame is willowy, but not unhealthily so, thankfully. My hair's also a bit straighter, like Inko's, missing some of the natural wave I vaguely recall from the few illustrations of the first I'd seen in my past life, but beyond that, the similarities are uncanny. Oh, you really like a lot of black and grey, Izuku comments at some point as he looks over the slowly growing pile of my selections. I like the grayscale, but I also like cool colors, like blues and teals and purples, I reply somewhat tersely. I may or may not be sulking. This store just doesn't have many of those colors available in fabrics I can tolerate. I get a consoling pat on the back in response. In the end, we return to the apartment with purchases in sets of 3, 1 for Izuku to wear to keep up appearances, 1 for me to wear, and a backup for me when the second is being washed, barring a few exceptions. Wool leggings, rain tank tops, long-sleeved and short-sleeved swim shirts, beanies, to hide my hair when I'm out and about on the physical plane, a pack of boxers, a pack of the closest we could get to compression socks for children, and a smoky grey heavy-wool double-breasted jacket with a hood and pocket that was on sale due to being off-season all comprise the entirety of my new wardrobe. Izuku and I exchange exhausted glances. Wanna stick to online shopping next time? I ask. He nods fervently. Heavy work, thankfully, works wonders on my sensitivity. Izuku and I make days of visiting park playgrounds and jungle gyms, usually after eating a hearty meal for 2 and making excuses to hang out with Kaken, clambering up and down anything we can feasibly climb. Izuku tags along gamely, content to follow along on the imperceptible plane. When we're outside and free of observers, we make a game of trying to see who can push the other further back, like those exercises I vaguely recall American football players engaging in. We're evenly matched, for the most part, but Izuku's shorter and stocky build lends him a little more concentrated power compared to my slightly taller frame and considerably leaner strength. As I stretch and exercise my muscles, the resulting deep ache grants me a grounding counterpoint to the rest of the stimuli that would otherwise overwhelm me. It is a long, slow process, but gradually, my skin sensitivity diminishes. I start to grow accustomed to textures and temperatures that would have left me freezing up or shying away in acute discomfort. I think I'll always be a little more overly aware of touch-based stimuli than the average person, if the way my acclimation plateaus is any indication. But at least I'm no longer at the mercy of my highly attuned perception. I no longer collapse into pained, shivering wrecks when rougher fabrics brush across my skin, or have borderline meltdowns when I take showers. It can still get a bit uncomfortable, but it no longer cripples me, no longer leaves me vulnerable. I can live with that. When we aren't at school or otherwise occupied with our extracurriculars, Izuku and I sneak off to experiment with our quirk. It turns out that we can't bring living things, barring plants, they appear to be the exception, for some odd reason, to the imperceptible plane. They just remain physical and phase through whoever is heading to the imperceptible plane. The cicada we caught seemingly humoured our tests long enough for us to make for attempts, but once it flew off, we decided to call it quits. It's a bit of a bummer, but we surmise that only Izuku and I have the necessary adaptations to access and traverse the two planes. We can take inanimate objects with us, but only what we can wear or feasibly carry. That still leaves me scratching my head in confusion, to be honest. From there, we turn our attention to making instantaneous switches, and devising a call and response system to keep the timing of the transition smooth. S, short for switch, becomes the request to swap planes. K, short for OK, is the go-ahead. Y, short for Y, is the request for information on the situation. U, short for unable or unadvisable, is the no-go. E, short for emergency, is the override for U. We're really living up to that pair of cell phones with limited data and coverage comparison with this new texting equivalent, aren't we? I comment dryly once we've agreed on and hammered out our shorthand communication. Izuku laughs. We even develop a few tactics for fights based off of spars in the dojo, where I make note of potential maneuvers and opportunities one could take to our advantage, and even spare Izuku a few bruises, if I were allowed to switch. Counters and ambushes, blocks and diversions. How effective our ideas will prove in an actual fight remains to be seen, but that doesn't stop us from having a blast brainstorming to our little heart's content. We do have a close call once or twice, where Izuku and I forget to switch planes. Walking around with shoes on no matter where I go is practically ingrained habit for me by this point, so I inadvertently track dirt all over the floors of our apartment unit when I'm on the physical plane. Thank the gods Inko doesn't pay too much attention to the fact that the footprints I leave don't match with the treads of Izuku's shoes. Though I do feel bad that Izuku gets scolded and tasked with the cleanup instead of me. It's all right, Yukuto, he reassures me as he scrubs at the dirt. I'm the one who forgot to pull myself back to the physical plane. I grimace and reluctantly concede that there's really not much I can do to initiate a switch if I'm already on the physical plane, unless I remember to remind Izuku. Still, it's not a very good experience to watch Izuku get saddled with cleaning up a mess of my own making. Occasional hiccups aside, life is good, until a fucking poor excuse for a middle school teacher calls Izuku out in front of the whole class for daring to apply to UA. Izuku doesn't curl into himself at his battered desk, but it's a close thing. Around him, his classmates dissolve into raucous laughter, and I'm left standing at his side, teeth gritting and hands balling into fists, furious on his behalf. Bakugo leaps from his desk and storms over to him, palms popping with agitated explosions, and Izuku narrowly avoids getting a new batch of bruises and burns when the blonde slams his hand down on Izuku's desk. Even in the midst of my frustrated outrage, I take pride in the fact that Izuku doesn't cower. He stares his childhood friend turned bully down, head up, chin level. Not looking down on him, but not deferring to him either. Attaboy. Bakugo seethes and spits his vitriol, and I return fire with words of my own, even if they don't reach their intended targets. How about you grow a fucking conscience, Bratsuki, I hiss, at the rate you're going, you're shaping up to be an Endeavor knockoff, or gods forbid, a 2.0, and Izuku's face twitches as he attempts to suppress a laugh and then a following grimace. Color me impressed, his poker face has gotten better. Class is dismissed shortly after, but Bakugo isn't done yet. With no notebook out in the open for him to torch, he skips straight to threatening Izuku some more before turning to leave. But I know better. Izuku, do you trust me? I ask over our link. Of course, he answers without hesitation. I nod jerkily and move to stand just behind him, raising my hands to cover his ears, muffling the unforgivable words that tumble from Bakugo's mouth barely seconds later. Fury roils in my gut as I glare daggers at the spoiled brat. At least Izuku doesn't have to hear his former friend tell him to commit suicide in this life. He doesn't need that shit weighing down on his mind. Zuko dallies on our way back to the apartment, which isn't an uncommon occurrence, per se, it's just, this time the scenic route he ends up taking happens to have a very familiar, very uncomfortably iconic underpass. As we approach, I am left with a very scary and heavy set of choices. First, I can convince Izuku to take a detour and avoid any potential encounter with the sludge villain, and subsequently, a potential and critical encounter with All Might. Supposing any of them even show up, I could be worried about nothing. Second, I can continue as is with Izuku, and we can hope that a combination of our training and our quirk can keep us safe long enough for help to arrive, in the event the sludge villain makes an appearance. It could be a valuable experience regarding ambushes and reacting to them. A primer for what we could run into as heroes, a trial by fire of sorts. With every step we take towards the foreboding dark of the tunnel, I grow tenser with a mix of anxiety and indecision. In the end, it comes down to me not wanting to betray Izuku. It's his life. He should get a say in how he lives it. Izuku, I rasp out, interrupting his chatter about Kamu Woods and Mount Lady. Only a few meters before we reach the entrance. Dangerous learning opportunity or safety in exchange for a missed chance? Izuku, observant as he is, has already noticed my mounting apprehension, so despite his initial confusion, he is quick to think over my vague but loaded question. His emerald eyes find mine a few moments later and harden with a determination and trust that takes my breath away. A nervous smile tilts the corners of his mouth up. Let's learn something new. I bow my head, closing my eyes briefly. Then be on guard. While not exactly relaxed prior to my abrupt and cryptic inquiry, Izuku's posture immediately transitions into something far more alert, poised and intent, ready to react at the first sign of anything amiss. One of the many useful skills he's taken and polished courtesy of his lessons in self-defense and meticulous analysis of countless heroes. The subtle transformation never fails to fill me with a quiet pride over how far he's come from the days he first started planning out what kind of hero he wanted to be. The world seems to darken as we enter the underpass, and I immediately start counting, eyes fixed on the deceptively innocuous manhole cover just a few feet ahead of us. We pass it without incident, but I don't relax, especially now that the point of entry is at our backs. 3 seconds later, I hear the sound of viscous fluid rising up out of the holes in the cover and coalescing into something massive and menacing. Thankfully, Izuku notices too, and immediately puts some distance between him and the towering form of sewage. The sludge villain's bulging eyes glint with a wild and desperate violence. An M-sized invisibility cloak, the fugitive comments, a wide grin with large, blocky teeth splitting open just below his squinting eyes. Izuku and I shiver at the sheer disregard in our ambusher's gaze. In his eyes, Izuku is little more than an object, something to be used and discarded. It's in this moment that something from my past life comes to mind unbidden. I'm reminded of a game I once played, wherein the occult and demons ran rampant. The sludge villain looks eerily similar to one in particular, Vile Abaddon. His words in the game's intro perch on the tip of my tongue. I give in to the temptation to say them, because honestly, they couldn't be more apartment. Peaceful days are over. Izuku tilts his head slightly at my softly spoken statement. My expression firms. Let's survive. I launch away from Izuku just as the sludge dives for him. As I watch like a hawk, Izuku tosses his backpack to the side and manages to follow it by rolling out of the way in time for the sludge to just barely miss him. Izuku regains some distance as the villain looks around briefly in confusion. Good. Now we've got an idea of how fast our attacker moves. The sludge whirls on him and snarls before surging forward again, this time spreading out in a veritable wave, correctly guessing that Izuku managed to dodge to the side. He calls across our link. K, I answer as I yank on the tether, and the villain passes through him ineffectively. Once he's clear, Izuku pulls back, resuming his place on the physical plane, I scanning for weaknesses to exploit. We keep up our risky game of cat and mouse for what feels like ages, but is in reality likely only a minute or two, if even that. There are a few close shaves, and the sludge villain snags Izuku once or twice only to lose him barely a second later each time. Thanks to our quirk, we definitely need to work on judging things we can feasibly avoid with or without our quirk, and our timing. It's just as Izuku switches back to the physical plane for the umpteenth time that the manhole cover bursts open and hits the ceiling of the tunnel with a startling clang. We all freeze, inadvertently holding our breaths, and then a familiar hero leaps up and into the underpass brandishing his signature grin like a reassurance and weapon all rolled into one. A relieved grin of my own crosses my features, and I can practically feel Izuku's discipline in the midst of a tense situation warring with his knee-jerk urge to start fanboying over his favorite hero. He settles for darting out of the line of fire and silently mouthing along with the words of All Might's catchphrase. "It's all right now, young man. I am here." The sludge villain has about 0.37 seconds to regret some of his more recent life decisions before the number one hero blurs into motion and scatters him with a single punch. Izuku has to brace himself against one of the walls of the tunnel to stay on his feet, his high-pitched shriek of delight barely audible over the howling winds kicked up from the powerful one-hit KO. I watch on in amusement, unaffected by the displaced air simply by virtue of chilling out in the imperceptible plane. All Might casts Izuku a glance to assess him for injuries, looks thoughtfully at the remnants of the now incapacitated sludge villain, considers his groceries, and finally starts forward confidently, pulling out a pair of 2-liter bottles of Torrent. "You gonna help him?" I prompt Izuku, who is practically vibrating in place like. I snort, lifting a hand to cover my mouth and stifle the ensuing hysterical giggles. Like a cell phone. Izuku needs no further encouragement. He bolts over to All Might with an excited, "How can I help?" All Might stops short, a look of surprise peeking through his default grin. Hey, now that I think of it, it must be rare for civilians to offer assistance to a hero, never mind the top hero. To his credit, he composes himself quickly and hands a bottle to Izuku. My goofball of a little brother in spirit looks like he's having a religious experience. "If you could empty this out, we can use it as a makeshift container for this guy," All Might states brightly. Thankfully for his dignity, Izuku manages to rein in his initial impulse to devolve into a gibbering pile of fanboy and immediately channels said potent force into the task entrusted to him with unbridled enthusiasm. "That's genius," he breathes as he pours the beverage out into the gutter. And then he keeps going, mouth moving a mile a minute with his excitement. Completely undeterred even as he shovels bits of whatever the sludge villain is made of, including an honest-to-God's eye, into his bottle with his bare hands. I am both mildly disgusted and completely in awe. All Might keeps one eye on Izuku as he tackles his portion of the task, likely to make sure Izuku's handling the whole process without issue, but also, I realize as I examine the hero's expression, to lend the animated middle schooler a genuine listening ear as he rambles. Because this sludge guy is composed mainly of liquid, handcuffs and other conventional restraints would be essentially useless, even if we had them on hand. But bottles, plastic and glass, are usually airtight and made for holding liquid, and are most likely next to impossible to open from the inside, which, while unorthodox, is still a perfect temporary method of containment. All Might beams brightly at Izuku once he concludes his brief analysis, and I wonder at how much more natural this smile looks compared to the one the hero puts on for his audience. "You're pretty smart, young man," he praises warmly. And here comes the blush. "Oh no, it's just, I only." I huff and roll my eyes. "Just take the compliment and say thank you, Izuku," I advise him fondly. Izuku dithers for maybe a moment more before uttering a quiet and bashful, "Thank you." Of course, comes All Might's cheerful response just as he caps his now full bottle. "How are things on your end?" Izuku visibly shakes himself. "Almost done, All Might, sir." He stuffs the rest of the sludge villain into the bottle he was charged with, screws the cap on as tight as he can, and hands it over to All Might. "Thank you, young man. I appreciate your assistance in helping apprehend this villain. The thing is, he actually sounds like he does. I'm glad you managed to escape injury, as well. You and me both, All Might. But now that the sludge villain has been contained, that reminds me. Hey Izuku, are you going to ask for his autograph?" Izuku would never forgive me if I let him forget and miss this opportunity. That's a lie. He'd forgive me, but he'd never stop lamenting the oversight. "Oh!" Izuku exclaims abruptly, causing All Might to tense briefly in alarm. "All Might!" May I ask for your autograph? All Might laughs heartily, tucking the bottles into his pants pockets and brushing his hands off on his pants before reaching over and ruffling Izuku's hair. Distilled, effervescent joy radiates throughout the link from Izuku's end. Kid's gone practically supernova in the happiness department. Of course. Do you have anything I could sign? And maybe something to sign with? One sec, Izuku wheezes out, moving to recover his backpack from the underpass only once All Might removes his hand from his hair, and not a second before. Can you believe this, kid? I ask All Might quietly with an eye roll, fondly amused despite myself. Of course, the hero doesn't hear me, and as such doesn't react or respond, but still, I feel like it had to be said. I am never, ever, going to wash my hair again after this, Izuku's thought leaks into the link as he trots back, frantically digging through his backpack for a notebook and pen. I wrinkle my nose. Izuku, no. If you absolutely must preserve the moment in some way, trim some of your hair and keep the clippings in a plastic bag with a label, I suggest, more than a little exasperated over the fact that kind of advice just came out of my mouth. Please don't neglect your hygiene over this. Izuku has the decency to shoot me the equivalent of a sheepish grin across our link. I shake my head with a lopsided smile, watching as All Might pens out an autograph, this one addressed specifically to Izuku, unlike the one in canon, before returning the notebook and marker. Izuku accepts them both reverently, eyes practically brimming with tears. This will become a family heirloom, he promises solemnly, his voice shaking with emotion. I can't even find it in me to feel embarrassed, or tease Izuku. It's just somehow too pure. All Might must pick up on it as well, because his smile gentles. I'm sorry to say that I must be going, he says, after a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Will you be all right? Izuku does a quick check to make sure he's all good before nodding. Thank you for saving me, All Might. He smiles wide and blinding as he says it, and I find myself squinting and wishing I had a pair of sunglasses. It'd be a shame to look away and miss such a rare expression of complete joy from Izuku. All Might nods back and starts prepping for a superpowered leap. A look of realization dawns on Izuku's face. Oh. He reaches out and grabs hold of the fabric of All Might's pant leg. Oh wait, real quick, is all he gets out before All Might lifts off, unintentionally dragging Izuku along for the ride.